This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, Sampath. A deadly terrorist attack in Moscow on March 22nd left more than 130 people dead and nearly 200 injured. This was the deadliest mass shooting incident in Russia since the 2004 Beslan school siege. The Islamic State Khorasan Province, or ISKP as it's known, has claimed responsibility for the attack. President Vladimir Putin has said that radical Islamists were behind this attack, while also suggesting Ukraine's involvement without really substantiating it. So why are radical Islamists and the Islamic State in particular targeting Russia, and why now? We try and unpack the context, implications and potential repercussions of this attack in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Mr. MK Bhadrakumar, a strategic analyst and former diplomat who has served in West Asia. Mr. Bhadrakumar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, sir, to start with, can you please unpack for the benefit of our listeners the origins and current configuration of the Islamic State? It's a dreaded terrorist organization which everybody knows. But this ISKP, as it's called, which has claimed responsibility for the Moscow attack. Where does it come from? What are its affiliations? Is it part of the original IS, which we know is very strong in Iraq and so on? Can you just give us some insights into this?
Well, you have really addressed the core issue here, because Islamic State is a rubric which we apply, in circumstances such as this, emergent in Russia, with a certain kind of assumption. It's a beast, feared, much feared, very violent, and with a ideology and a global agenda. So when we speak about Islamic State, we tend to look at it in terms of Islamic militancy, political Islam, a heady cocktail, involving all these things. But there is, at the same time, there is a strong geopolitical angle to it. If you are familiar with this name, Michael Flynn, who was Trump's original choice for national security advisor, he was actually what can you call compulsorily retired by the Obama administration on this ground, that when he was heading the Pentagon's military intelligence apparatus in Washington after a tenure in Iraq, he took objection to the gravitation of the American policy towards finessing the Islamic State, towards finessing the extremist elements who were in American custody in Iraq during the operation.
So what do you mean by finessing the Islamic terrorists? What does it mean?
Yeah, finessing in the sense that we see different manifestations of it, starting with Brzezinski's thinking at the time of the Afghan jihad, when the Soviet intervention took place, to apply this formula in the Hindu Kush, which is injecting militant Islamist groups for geopolitical purposes to pay the Russians back, as he himself said, and he has admitted this. There is nothing original in what I'm saying. To return what the Russians had done to them in Vietnam War. So that is one way of it. The second manifestation we have seen in Syria and in Iraq itself, and the third manifestation we see in Afghanistan. Now one common thread that you look into this. Yesterday there was a very interesting article in the Turkish media in this prominent newspaper called Sabah, and it's a very interesting article insofar as it is shown there that there is a very strange coincidence that this Islamic militant Islamist group, terror group, it doesn't attack Israel, it doesn't attack the United States, it doesn't attack the Western powers. Its main victims are Turkey, Iran, Russia, and so on. So now, so this is what I'm saying. It's a very strange beast. It's a riddle wrapped in mystery. And, this is what it is. And it has always been like.
Is it not possible that this group does not attack Israel and Russia and US because of capability reasons? That it might have a greater capability to attack Russia rather than Israel, or maybe tactical reasons.
Well, let me go a step further. That it has been alleged, in fact, by Iran, Russia, and Turkey also. And in this Sabah article, the Turkish security officials have been quoted as saying that often enough they function as subcontractors. So it is not only that that they don't attack. If they do not attack, there is a larger meaning in it. It is because they are subserving the Western interests, Israeli interests. Israelis have partnered with Al Qaeda and Islamic State in Syria. Now, the Iranians have been saying this all along, but we don't want to hear it. That's a different matter. So you see, it's Mr. Sampath, it is not a question of propaganda. These are there are tangible evidences. Now, on February 13, in fact, the Russian intelligence agency brought out a detailed statement alleging that the erstwhile Islamic State fighters who are unemployed or underemployed today have been selectively recruited and are being trained intensely in the camp called Al-Tanf. I think it may be familiar to you. It's on a strategically placed American base in the southeast, bordering Iraq, in Syria. Now, on the main highway between Damascus and Baghdad. Now, that is very well protected, very well fortified thing, and some Russian aircrafts tried to approach that place, and they were immediately intimidated by American interceptors. This is a kind of thing. And then what do? They have been recruiting agents from Central Asian countries, focused from the Islamic fighters, from the Islamic State fighters, who have been detained after the Raqqa operations and so on in the Syrian conflict, and are being trained for future missions. So, it's not a question of, it's not accidental what I said, that, if they do not attack, you do not attack your mentors. It's as simple as that. So, unless we get into the heart of the matter here, we cannot discuss this Moscow attacks when Americans say that Islamic State. In fact, my feeling is the Americans made a faux pas there. Why? Because this will bring out into the open the true nature of this beast. Because I've seen Indian newspapers, for instance, writing editorials about the threat of Islamic State to Russia and so on, assuming, immediately lapping up the Western narrative that this is exactly what has happened there. Now, the very fact that, that in real time the Americans came out with this allegation shows its real purpose, which is to confuse people. And dumb-witted people or ill-informed people, including in the Indian media, have jumped to conclusions already. Is it possible that, that Americans who still are unable to fathom what happened on Nord Stream sabotage, or even 9/11 attacks, there are many theories still floating, could conclusively come out with a statement like this, that Islamic State perpetrated this, and follow up the subtext of it is Ukraine is not involved. You have the story there if you want to look at it objectively and rationally.
Right. So, but there is also, like what you just said, there have been a lot of Western analysts who have sort of tried to zero in on the motives for the Islamic State attacking Russia, and they have said that Russia's relations with the Taliban, which is a rival of the ISIS in Afghanistan, Russia's oppression of Muslim populations, especially in Chechnya, and also in parts of Africa through its Wagner group, its military campaigns against ISIS fighters in Syria. So all these things have been on getting on the nerves of these various ISIS groups, and also its relationships with the regimes in Syria and Iran. So these are being cited as reasons and motives for the ISIS's targeting of Russia. So don't you think there is some substance to these theories, these hypotheses as well?
I can only give you a counterpoint. Do all these things add up to even a fraction of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza? And that is the headline today. Where is the Islamic State there? If Houthis are there, where is the Islamic State? That is the counterpoint. So if excesses are taking place, including in India, in such operations against insurgency and terrorism. But if they take place, the retaliation comes not on account of that. It is because of a certain agenda. The retaliation comes. It continues. But it is not always on the basis of a symmetrical response, a proportional response, or anything like that. I'm not holding a brief for the Russians. Russians may be having their own techniques in containing Islamic militancy. India has, China has, many countries have, even Turkey has. Because Turkey is actually, what is little known there, is also a victim of Islamic terrorism, as they call in America. But that is not the issue here. The issue here is that you have here in what is happening in after the Holocaust. Has such a thing ever happened in this planet, as is happening in the Levant, in Gaza and West Bank? So, if there is a genuine Islamist movement, it has every reason to feel infuriated by what is happening, what the Israelis are doing. Where is the Islamic State there?
Right. So you are saying that the very fact that there have been no pushback or attacks against Israeli assets by the Islamic State would indicate that this entire hypothesis of some kind of grievance over the treatment of Muslims by Russia doesn't really hold water.
We are digressing from the topic, the main topic. In fact, if you delve on this, it will be a waste of time, because I made the point that that Islamic State is a many splendid thing, and it is being used as a rubric to characterize situations in a certain way from a geopolitical perspective. That is the point I am making, and I am sticking to that. But I am not trying to say that there is no Islamic State element at all involved in this bombing, in this terrorist attack in Moscow. On the other hand, on the contrary, my estimation, sitting here in India, my estimation is that there is a very strong likelihood of whoever have masterminded this operation, and much planning has gone into it, and it is inconceivable that without a state support, certain aspects of this could have happened in the way that they happened. Now, all these things suggest that there is a possibility that someone has again used these people as subcontracted to these people, the Islamic State. But the operation is not a typical Islamic State operation either. It has certain unique characteristics, and experts have run a fine comb through it and have shown a number of areas, including actually American experts and Americans who have worked in the CIA and have handled this sort of
like what kind of unique characteristics? Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, I'll tell you. For example, Islamic State's trademark is that they consider martyrdom to be the ultimate blessing. And when people are put into this kind of operation, they are fired up by that notion that they are reaching heaven if they get killed. That is the first point that you have to say. That is the trademark, and that is what actually made them so very fearsome in the consciousness of the world public opinion. Now, these four guys did shooting there. For actually speaking, their operation was a 15-minute long operation, and there was absolutely no touch that this was a suicide mission of the type that Islamic State people take pride in. Number two, they have confessed that they are hirelings, and they were working for money, and a certain amount of money was advanced to them, and they have been issued credit cards and so on. So you see, if Tajiks are these people are ethnic Tajiks, as reports suggest, I mean, as someone who has lived in that area, it's a very pathetic situation there. The abject poverty in those countries. You can get a woman to sleep with you for absurd amounts. Like when I was ambassador there, I have heard, stories, that a woman would sleep if you could, give some food. This is the kind of abject poverty. And the kind of money that has to be given to these people, and these are migrant workers and so on who go to Russia. And if you talk to Russians, you will find that certain kind of jobs which nobody will want to work for, and for wages, which are so absurdly low, these people are so eager to work, because when they are transferred back to their home country, their parents can eat, their wives can eat, their children can eat. It becomes big money in the black market when this foreign currency is converted. So, when you speak about, $5,000 or $10,000 for you and I, it may not look as something attractive for risking your life. But the Central Asian reality is different. So that's what I'm saying, that it is quite likely that some of these guys have been brought in for this purpose, so that there is a way for the mentors to distance themselves from the actual operation. This another point which is very clear there is that this is actually, I am borrowing from a very well-known and senior CIA, ex-CIA official, Larry Johnson, and who has said that he studied the video recordings. The Russians have released the video recordings also. And from the recordings, it is very clear that these guys are actually doing a random firing. Random firing means, just like that, and the way they were holding the gun, etc. It showed that they had minimal training in handling weapons. And they were just doing it like that. And there was no other purpose. So in other words, it was an act of motiveless malignity. There's nothing beyond it. There was no jihadism there. There was no ideology in it. And there was no conviction even in it. These were people who were desperately poor, who were doing a job for the money that was offered to them. But this doesn't really carry the stamp of the imprimatur of the Islamic State. And the most important point is the finding that President Putin himself released within a day of the American claim that Ukraine had no hand in it. And for what reason the Americans did it within hours of the incident, that Ukraine had no hand in it. As I mentioned, this is a superpower which is still struggling to explain Nord Stream sabotage. It doesn't understand who committed that, and we know who committed it, but that's what it is. So this superpower, within hours, almost in real time, came out with a bold statement, audacious statement, that Ukraine had no hand in it. Within less than a day later, I'm sure that the Russians released this information for that purpose. President Putin, in his address to the nation, mentioned that they were heading toward the Ukraine border. If they were wanting to escape, they could have gone into Belarus, they could have gone into the Baltic area or somewhere and disappeared. And in the case of certain assassinations which took place in Russia, like Alexander Dugin's daughter and so on, the famous philosopher and humanist, Alexander Dugin's daughter, they just escaped, the woman just escaped to the north, to the Baltic area. In a vehicle, she just drove across and disappeared. So you could have done it to Belarus. And there have been a statement from Belarus also that they were tightening up the border there with Russia. But these guys went westwardly and then southwest direction, and in a particular direction. And they apparently have confessed that Putin says a window was kept open for them to cross the border. Now, it's a very long border, and it is a porous border, and there is a war going on, chaotic conditions there all over the place. But a certain place they were told to use for crossing over to Ukraine. This is a very, very big telltale sign. So, all this put together, the benefit of the doubt can be given that some erstwhile sympathizers or fellow travelers of the Islamic State were recruited for this operation, and they carried it out because of the lure of money. But you can put the stamp on the Islamic State. Today, if you put the stamp on the Islamic State is, where is it? It cannot, it doesn't have a headquarter. It doesn't have a habitation and a name. It cannot deny. So you can affix it to say that this was a show by the Islamic State. This, I think, in my estimation, is what seems to have happened. And the Russians seem to be struggling with the evidence they have, because unless the evidence is transmuted as proof, it will be very difficult to pin it on the people in Kiev or their mentors.
Right. So, despite struggling with the evidence, Mr. Bhadrakumar, Putin has said nonetheless that Ukraine, or he has suggested that Ukraine is going to be was involved in the terror attack, and now coming back to
No.
Russia's.
Mr. Sampath, let me contradict you. Mr.
Yeah.
Putin didn't say that.
Okay.
In
But
fact,
there have been reports saying that he has said Ukraine's involvement cannot be ruled out.
well, the point is, it is the reading that you and I are free to make, and we have rationally arrived at. But Putin, you cannot attribute it to Putin. In fact, Putin's spokesman Peskov said even yesterday, do not jump into any conclusions, because it's a very serious matter for the Russians. And they are, very professionally, very painstakingly putting together the pieces, collecting them from the rubble, from the debris, and analyzing. All the weapons are there. Now, we don't know, for example, whether the weapons markings had been erased deliberately before the operation when it was given to these four fellows, or the markings were there. Now, if the markings were there, it is easier to trace the weapons. So there are many hidden angles to this which we do not know. Therefore, Putin has said it very measured way. He has spoken about the deliberate movement of these people in the same car in which they arrived there at the site of the crime, and driving in the southwesterly direction to the Ukrainian border, headed there purposely without any kind of hesitation. And they had driven hundreds of kilometers already in that direction because they were so very clear about where they were heading for. And this testimony probably, or interrogation result, that why were they going in that direction, the interrogators would have asked the Russian interrogators. And they would seem to have said that they were told to go in that direction. And President used the word, a window had been kept open for them. That's all he said. Now, of course, a number of other officials, that the subtext is a number of other officials, Russian and foreigners, are rationally assuming that this is what was intended.
There have also been videos released by the ISIS. I think the shoulder camera, whatever. What do you make of that aspect of the entire discourse?
See, these are forensic details. Now, how did these video recordings reach the Islamic State is a very big question. And we know, for example, the advisories were issued by the American and British embassies. And these advisories, having been a diplomat myself before, we know that such advisories are not suo motu issued by the missions. They come on the basis of very clear instructions, highly classified cables from headquarters. So, it stands to reason the Americans felt the urge to put it in the public domain, first of all. And if they were actionable intelligence, they should have been shared with the target country, which is Russia in that case. But the Russians say that it was so bland, there was nothing actionable there from the operational point of view. So, they put it in the public domain because this crime, horrific crime, and in the downstream discussions and its impact on the Ukraine war, trajectory of the Ukraine war, and its profound geopolitical consequences, all taken into account, ground is prepared for the conquest of the public domain. So that it was known that it was an Islamic State thing, and step by step, the ground had been prepared. And you know, the American Embassy advisory has been almost verbatim repeated by the British. And you know, the intelligence agencies of these countries work in tandem. And it's, of course, if you are closely following Ukraine, you know that the power structure in Kiev is faction ridden, and the presidency is completely in the hands of the British intelligence. And the intelligence agency as such of Bogdanov, military intelligence, is in the hands of the Americans. So when they put these together, it's only common sense that they had the same source, which is Kiev.
Right. One last question, Mr. Bhadrakumar. So you've tried to demonstrate that this Islamic State is a rubric, and there have been subcontracting or hirelings kind of a situation here. Now, what are the options Moscow has in terms of a response to this provocation? I mean, it clearly, we don't expect Russia to respond the way Israel did to October 10th, or US would have in the past to such a provocation. So what are the options Moscow has? Right now, of course, it is gathering evidence. You sort of pointed to that. But in terms of the geopolitical dimension, what are the repercussions and options that we could look out for?
You know, Mr. Sampath, the thing is, I use the word struggling. I got the impression the Russians are struggling to come up with proof. Because if there is a proof, they have immense power, seamless power, unlimited way they can deploy it there to wreak vengeance on the forces which organize this. It can take many forms. It can mean that, you know, the self-restraint that the Russians have been adopting so far about the presence of the string of CIA stations along the Ukraine's border with Russia, and which have been actually fine-tuning the Ukrainian, so-called Ukrainian operations deep inside Russia. Now, they could, for instance, go for eliminating them. They could do that. Now, they have been so far not doing that because they do not want to give an alibi to the NATO for a direct intervention, alleging that NATO countries have been attacked and invoking Article 5 and so on. So if the proof is very clear, they could go for it. You know, a limited attack on one place near in Donetsk killed something like about 100 French troops. And Macron is still struggling with it because, you know, the point is these soldiers, they're on a denial mode, saying that these are freedom fighters. These are mercenaries, in other words, the French mercenaries. But then the fact remains that, you know, they are enlisted men and they are entitled to privileges. Their families are entitled to privileges after death, and they have to be given a decent burial, you know. So Macron is struggling with that. So, you know, the point I'm saying is that the spectrum of Russian reaction has to be discussed very thoroughly because there are very many options available. And there are very many variables in the investigation outcome that we have to take into account. So the totality of the Russian response is going to be, at a minimum, I feel that the door for peace talks is closed. And I don't know what we are discussing with the Ukrainians today in Delhi. You know, we are barking up the wrong tree. Things are going to take a very different turn. And number two, if they have established, the Russians have established, and although they don't have any concrete proof, like say to assemble on the table XYZ way, even then, if they are convinced that there is an Ukrainian hand, they will go for the jugular veins of the regime in Kiev. Now, it also depends on where the trail leads to, because the Russians also have a fairly strong intelligence setup within Ukraine. And if it goes to people like Bogdanov, I'm mentioning a name which is unethical on my part, but mentioning a name nonetheless, because he's head of the military intelligence and there's a proven track record of being a mastermind in planning and executing terrorist acts or subversive acts inside Russia, then he could be a target. Now, that is just Zelensky's right hand man. Or where does it go? So it also depends on the kind of conclusions that the Russians draw. But one thing is clear, that they are not going to now look at peace as the peace talks, as any thing of consequence. The Russian assumption so far had been that this being an election year, President Biden's calculation would be to see that this pot keeps boiling, but boiling in a very static way, a kind of a controlled disequilibrium. But nothing untoward, nothing extra, which might impact the campaign in the US till November. But now here, what has happened is a terrible duty is born. And, it is bound to have its impact on the American campaign and everywhere, because it is bound to impact the Russian-American relations, and it is bound to impact President Putin's foreign policy. You see, it's difficult to conclude because, you know that on March 5, Victoria Nuland, the acting Deputy Secretary of State, Blinken announced that she was retiring. I'm sure you came across that report. Now she's not an ordinary person. She's a demigod when it comes to the Ukraine turf, because she was the one who plotted, and it's recorded. Recordings available. BBC had recorded it. Recordings are available about how precisely she decided who should actually take over in Kyiv after the coup in February 2014. Now she has been removed from the setup. And one thing is, she had just come from Kyiv. And in her farewell message from there to the Russians, and she is a known Russophobe and of East European origin. And in her farewell message from Kyiv, she said that in my departing message, I'm going back pleased because there are going to be some surprises for Putin. Surprises for Putin. And things are okay for the Ukrainians. They are organizing themselves. This is the kind of statement she made publicly to this effect. Now, she didn't explain it, but the Americans should have asked her some question, knowing her background after she went back, what it is. So, the curious thing is, her retirement was announced on March 5, and the American advisory or the American embassy was issued on March 7. Now, there are coincidences. These are telltale signs. I don't know. I'm sure the Russians are, connecting the dots. So the ultimate reaction is bound to be on the basis of the conclusions that they take. And they are not going to put the focus more than necessary on the propaganda side in the public domain. Because this is an existential question. Because if this gets repeated time and again inside Russia, there are going to be consequences for Russian politics. There are going to be consequences for social stability, inter-ethnic amity, and so on. India has experienced some of these factors in its contemporary history. So the reaction is going to be a layered one.
Right, a layered reaction, Mr. Bhadrakumar.
Its acuteness will depend on the kind of conclusions that the Russians draw, their leadership draws, and the political decisions that are taken there. But war is escalating. That is the bottom line.
Right. It's a pretty murky yet grim situation out there. When, as you said, the cookie cutter narrative about it being an attack of radical Islam, jihadis, and so on. I think that's more of a layer beneath which I think you have sought to peel it off and expose what actually are the forces at play, the geopolitical dimension, which you've drawn attention to. And of course, the three big points you made about how this could affect Russia-American relations, which are already at a low point even more. It could affect Putin's foreign policy, and of course, the kind of responses from Russia to this kind of a provocation is something we have to wait and watch out for. Thank you so much, Mr. Bhadrakumar, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and observations on this unfolding story. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Mr. Sampath. It's always a pleasure to be interviewed by someone like you, because you have a level of erudition that is very rare in our media. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.